Hi, everyone. We're going to wait about a minute for people to join. All right, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, good afternoon or morning, wherever you are. My name is Rachel Reese. I'm the Communications and Digital Marketing Manager at CF Leads, and we're so excited to be presenting this webinar with the Urban Institute. We have a wonderful program for you today about the Urban Institute's Upward Mobility Framework. But before we get started, we just have a few housekeeping items. So because this is a webinar format, you can hear and see us, but we can't hear or see you. And if you have any technical issues, please feel free to join using the phone number on the screen, and you can use the webinar ID. We also are going to have a Q&A at the end, so please feel free to post any questions you may have in the Q&A box. And anything else? Oh yes, lastly, this webinar will be recorded and we'll be posting it tomorrow on our website. And now I'm going to hand it over to Leonard Brock, who's the VP for Learning and Impact at CF Leads.
Thank you, Rachel. And thank you everyone for joining the third webinar in the new CF Leads Economic Mobility webinar series. This webinar series features varied stakeholders working to advance economic mobility throughout the field. Economic mobility, in many references, is the most important issue of the 21st century. How we define economic mobility may vary from one community to the next, but the ultimate goal or aim is always to strengthen the economic vitality of individuals and families throughout the world. This requires a multi-pronged approach, which consists of several component parts, like addressing racial inequity, gender inequity, sustainability, and ensuring there aren't unintended consequences in or future harm. In this third webinar, we will take a deep dive into Urban Institute's framework for increasing upward mobility and explore how community foundations could play a significant role. CF Leads believes that the Urban Institute's upward mobility framework is helpful to community foundations because it provides a comprehensive and holistic approach to understanding and addressing the economic challenges of low-income individuals and communities. The framework takes into account the various factors that contribute to poverty and economic hardship, such as education, health, housing, and employment. By understanding how these factors interact and influence each other, community foundations can better identify the areas most in need of targeted interventions and investments. CF Leads hopes that by using the Urban Institute's Upward Mobility Framework, community foundations could develop more effective and comprehensive strategies to improve the economic prospects of individuals and communities. The framework emphasizes the need to coordinate public and private investments, engage in strategic partnerships, and ensure sustainability. It also encourages community foundations to seek out community-driven solutions to prioritize the needs of those facing the most significant economic challenges. Ultimately, CF Leads believes that by utilizing the Urban Institute's Upward Mobility Framework, community foundations can be better equipped to identify the root causes of economic mobility and to develop more effective and equitable solutions. By taking a holistic approach to understanding and addressing economic hardship, CF Leads hopes to see greater impact and progress in improving the economic situation of individuals and communities. Joining me today from the Urban Institute are the following presenters for today's webinar. Tina Chalitza, Policy Associate at Urban Institute, William Engelhardt, Senior Training and Technical Assistance Manager, Urban Institute, and Arizo Azizi, Policy Assistant at the Urban Institute. Welcome, welcome you all. And I would like to turn it over to Will to get us kicked off.
Thank you so much, Leonard, and thank you, Rachel, as well, for the kind words about the Urban Institute and the Upward Mobility Framework. I really appreciate it, and thank you for the introduction as well. And hi, everybody. As Leonard mentioned, my name is Will Engelhardt. I'm a Senior Training and Technical Assistance Manager with the Urban Institute. And as I believe Leonard mentioned, Urban Institute's a national nonprofit, nonpartisan research and policy organization based out of Washington, D.C. And myself and my colleagues, along with some others who will be on this call, Tina Chalize and Arizo Azizi, will be talking about the Upward Mobility Framework and how community foundations can hopefully use it. Yeah, if you go to the next slide, please. So we'll just be going over the Upward Mobility Framework and talking about how it was developed and why it was developed and how hopefully it can be a resource to you all. Then we'll talk about the mobility metrics as well, and preferably how you all can potentially use that in your jurisdictions, and walk through another resource that's available to folks, the Planning Guide for Local Action. We'll then be talking about building cross-sector partnerships for systems change, specifically for community foundations, and ways that we can take lessons learned from the Planning Guide and implement them with community foundations. And then finally, we'll be doing a deeper dive, and Tina will be walking through the data tables that provide ways to use the mobility metrics in your specific jurisdiction. And finally, bring it back to Leonard to go over some questions that you all may have and answer anything that may come up. So feel free to put questions in the chat throughout, and we'll make sure to get to it at the end. Just a reminder that this will be recorded and shared out with folks afterwards. And otherwise, I'll send it over to Arizo.
Great. Thanks so much, Will. Hi, everybody. Once again, my name is Arizo. I'm a policy assistant in the Research to Action Lab at the Urban Institute, and I'm excited to share a brief overview and background of the Upward Mobility Framework with you all before turning it over to Tina to talk more about the mobility metrics. So historically, mobility from poverty has been often viewed as only a matter of individual ability and hard work. But in recent decades, more and more research has started to show that today's reality doesn't align with our traditional understanding of the American dream. People experiencing poverty face a web of obstacles that often undermine their best efforts. So we have factors like racial prejudice, discrimination, and segregation that have created persistent and systemic barriers to upward mobility for people of color in the US. And public policies and institutional practices have created and sustained profound racial inequities and injustice, as well as disadvantages for other marginalized groups. And so while it can take decades to measure generational mobility trends, research shows that a range of important factors influence mobility in the short and medium term, and that local leaders can create and bolster the conditions that boost upward mobility and narrow racial inequities for children and adults. But to build the public will and achieve meaningful progress, communities need actionable metrics that they can use to assess current conditions and to monitor their progress. So our framework for boosting upward mobility and advancing equity provides local leaders with these metrics and also various tools to support local planning. So the Upward Mobility Framework builds on a previous effort by the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty, led by Urban, who asked the question, what would it take to dramatically and sustainably increase mobility from poverty? And among the many contributions of that group, they argue that mobility is more than just economic success, that true upward mobility requires people to have power and autonomy and a sense of being valued by their community. So this broader conception of mobility, which we often refer to as the three-part definition, drives our work. And so once again, the three parts are economic success, or when a person has adequate income and assets to support their and their family's material well-being. Power and autonomy, or when a person has the ability to have control over their life to make choices and to influence larger policies and actions that affect their future. And then finally, being valued in community, or when a person feels the respect, dignity, and sense of belonging that comes from contributing to and being appreciated by people in their community. And so all that's to say is, how did we get from this three-part definition of upward mobility to a suite of mobility metrics data? We realized that for communities to become launch pads of upward mobility, they need the intermediate term measures of conditions that they can influence. So we sought out to create this comprehensive but concise set of metrics that local leaders can use to plan strategy and to monitor progress.
Awesome. Thank you, Arzo. Hello again, everyone. My name is Tina Chalidza, and I'm a policy associate at the Research to Action Lab here at Urban. And so, yes, I'll be walking you through each component of the upward mobility framework and the suite of metrics to help you understand what all these different components mean and how realistically they fit together. So here on this slide, we have a visual of the upward mobility framework overall. And you'll see at the top there, is upward mobility from poverty, because that is, of course, our primary and driving goal of this effort. Every part of the framework below that top thing is a structural support towards that goal. And we started with this interconnected three-part definition of mobility from poverty that Arzo just showed you. Economic success, power and autonomy, and dignity and belonging are those three components that holistically represent upward mobility. And then supporting mobility from poverty are 5 essential pillars. The first pillar is opportunity-rich and inclusive neighborhoods here on the left, because neighborhoods play, of course, a very central role in supporting families' stability and well-being, their access to social and economic opportunities, and their children's chances to thrive and succeed in the future. Then we have high quality education, the pink pillar here, because from preschool through post-secondary education, education provides a crucial avenue for economic and social mobility for everyone across the board. Our third pillar here is rewarding work, because of course, jobs and wages constitute the primary source of income and economic security for most people in the US today. We also have a healthy environment and access to good health care. Good and stable health helps people of all ages surmount life's various challenges, lets them excel in school and on the job, and it just generally ensures their family's well-being and allows them to fully participate in their communities as well. And then lastly, this pillar here is responsive and just governance, because a governance that's attentive to the needs of all community members and residents who are engaged in decision-making are generally hallmarks of a community that is successfully supporting upward mobility. Now, across all of these pillars is a key foundation here: ensure equitable access for all, including people of color and other marginalized groups. Combating persistent racial inequities across all of these pillars is very central to achieving upward mobility in all of our communities. So this emphasis on racial equity is highlighted across all elements of our framework. Under each pillar, you'll see a set of key predictors for mobility from poverty. These evidence-based predictors are strongly associated with the likelihood that a community can create conditions to boost the economic and social mobility of its residents, whilst also narrowing racial and ethnic inequities. And then finally, we come to the mobility metrics. For each predictor, which was those colorful boxes that you saw before, the working group selected a specific data point, a metric, that can be used to compare and monitor a community's performance over time. So the mobility metrics are our way of taking an aspect of the predictor of upward mobility and making it more actionable. And of course, no data source is perfect, but we aimed to select mobility metrics that best balance a variety of considerations. So, of course, several different data points could reasonably represent each of the predictors in our framework, but we were charged with choosing a concise number. So we developed 7 criteria that we wanted all of our metrics to meet. The first was that they were valid. So this just means that the data point that is chosen is well established or accepted in research and in policy, and is also an accurate measure of the causal mechanism that the predictor represents. Then we wanted the metric to be widely available, meaning that it draws upon an existing and accessible data resource for communities nationwide. We also wanted the metric to be repeated at regular intervals, meaning that it's routinely measured to allow for effective monitoring and to also allow for the signaling of potential effects of policy interventions over time. We also wanted each metric to be geographically mindful. This just means that the metric is available at the city or county level and is less sensitive to resident turnover as well. We wanted the metric to be consistent across time and geography, so meaning that it would ensure a meaningful tracking and clear comparison within and across different localities. And then these last two, we wanted them to be structurally relevant, meaning that each metric would help identify a systemic condition rather than an individual level outcome. And also we wanted them to be structurally equitable and inclusive of important subgroups. So this just means that we want the metric to help identify structural equity in the community, acknowledging that people experience, poverty and upward mobility differently based on their circumstances and background. So we asked if each data point, can this be disaggregated by race or ethnicity or other characteristics that can help us distinguish between groups of privilege and those of disadvantage? And so really briefly again, before we move forward, I want to reiterate all of these terms that we are using. We understand this is a lot of new terminology. So these images that you see at the top, once again, those are called pillars. And they are just an organizing mechanism so that we can group all the different components that we have in our framework. Underneath each of these pillars are multiple predictors. These are the variables that were, again, chosen based on evidence and research that was vetted thoroughly. So these are all the colorful boxes that you saw previously before. And then under each of those, each predictor has at least one representative metric data point that is used to measure that predictor and make it actionable for people on the ground. So for example, here for the rewarding work pillar, one of the predictors under that pillar is employment opportunities, and the mobility metric that we have that represents that predictor is employment to population ratio for adults between the ages of 25 and 54. Now, very briefly, I do want to go over, how people can realistically use these metrics. Of course, the ways in which they can be used is myriad, but we like to point out a couple. They can serve as a tool, for example, to compare your values to peer communities. You can also use them to highlight, potential structural barriers that might be contributing to racial inequities. They can be used to prioritize areas of action that can potentially have the greatest local impact based on what the data is telling you. They can also be leveraged to highlight interconnections among predictors from various different policy arenas that might allow you to engage the right cross-sector partners. And of course, metrics can be used to set targets for improving conditions over time, as well as monitor progress over time, depending on your initiative. Now, I'm going to pass this back over to Will, who is going to talk a little more about a resource that we have called the Local Planning Guide for Action and dive deeper into building cross-sector partnerships.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tina. I'm going to take us in a little bit of a broader direction, but also focus on ways that the community foundations can utilize, hopefully, these resources. So I'm going to head us down that path for a little bit, and then I'm going to turn it back in a minute to Tina, who's going to dive deeper into some of the metrics that we were talking about already. But just wanted to let folks know we're heading kind of in more of a conceptual discussion. And so this guide is building off of some work that we haven't actually discussed really, which is our partnership from the Boosting Upward Mobility Project, where we specifically were trying to actionalize some of this work, and where we partnered with 8 county governments specifically to assess how the metrics that Tina's been talking about could inform a process to develop cross-sector mobility action planning. And this led us to what you see on this screen here, which is our planning guide for local action. And the goal of that is to help local leaders undertake similar mobility action planning processes in their own communities, as we helped lead some jurisdictions through in those 8 counties. This guide is informed by best practices drawn from these cohort counties and from research, as Tina was mentioning, on systems change and evidence-based decision-making. The guide hopefully helps the local leaders better understand impediments to upward mobility and how to build a cross-sector team that can plan, advocate for, and implement a set of systems changes focused on bringing all members of your community out of poverty and creating more equitable
Oh, Will, I think you're on mute.
Thank you so much. Sorry about that. Can't go a session without being on mute one time. That was by accident. I just did it accidentally. Okay, so for this slide, the guide is intended to lead you through a planning process, as you see here, that involves building a cross-sector team, gathering and analyzing data, conducting community and stakeholder engagement, and identifying needed systems changes so that you can create a map which will set forth strategic actions to boost mobility from poverty and advance equity in your community. And that's actually just a couple of the steps. As you see, this is a 10-step process, and it's really an in-depth guide that Leonard was talking about at the outset. That's just a short 150 plus pages with lots of really great resources and hopefully really, really helpful for folks if you do want to dive deep into ways that you can implement this in your community. But that said, this guide was developed coming out of those 8 county that we were working with and was specifically designed for city and county government leaders to plan, advocate for, and implement a set of policy and program changes informed by these metrics focused on boosting upward mobility. So what these next couple slides that I'm going to go through will focus on, they were adapted from this guide to inform community foundations specifically, and were created in collaboration with a set of other community foundations that were interested in improving their engagement in the policy space in a more structured and systematic way. Still, just note that these slides are meant to help community foundations that are interested in improving their engagement in the policy space in a more structured way, and are meant to walk community foundations through the process of leveraging the mobility metrics, much in the way that this local action planning guide does. But we don't actually necessarily have a resource available like the 150 plus page planning guide. So hopefully these slides are helpful, or we'd be happy to communicate in the future on ways to leverage this in the work that you all are doing. Next slide, please. Okay, so in talking these through, first and foremost, it's important for community foundations to recognize the role that you, as a local foundation, can play in your community and the role that you want to play specifically. While we've provided examples here in this circle to the right of different roles that your foundation can act in, it's certainly possible that you all will want to assume multiple roles to enact change, or that your role will change across these roles that are highlighted here based on shifting needs and assume multiple roles potentially as well. That said, in looking at some of these roles now on the slide, hopefully some of these resonate in terms of the role that you see yourself playing in your community as it relates to upward mobility, economic mobility, and creating change, and also just in the role that you all generally play in your community. And hopefully you'd like to see yourself playing some of these roles specifically across typical issue areas. Of course, like being a funder would be one that I imagine most of you are involved in, but certainly a champion, a convener, an educator, et cetera, is hopefully something that you could see yourself playing. Next slide. Then in thinking through that role that you'd like to play in your community, you'll certainly be guided by the capacity that you'll all have. And we know that many of you might have some small capacity, small teams, not large capacity to grow your role. Still, we hope that you go beyond just assessing the capacity that you want to play and consider choices around what your role, your foundation wants to play or needs to play in creating systems change as it relates to upward mobility. In particular, do you want to lead this change? Do you want to participate in this change? Or do you want to be behind the scenes but fund these activities? These will all certainly influence the role that you all want to play, pointing back to that last slide that I was talking through. Great. When your community foundation is deciding to take action on systems change, there are a couple things that we think are key case-making elements that you'll need to clearly define the problem you're trying to address and the call to action you're trying to make. As you see from this slide here, this case-making relies heavily on data. We are the Urban Institute, and data guides a lot of the decisions that we make. But to get to this point, hopefully you all are relying on community engagement and feedback from community members about what you'd like to see and what they'd like to see in terms of changes systematically around upward mobility. But in terms of walking through this data, hopefully you're able to identify data that paints a picture of the challenge, including data on disparities and storytelling, to focus on how this challenge impacts real people directly. Hopefully also you're able to find data on current expenditures, initiatives, programs, policies, and why these efforts may be insufficient, or data on structural racism and historical policies that lead to the state in your community that you're trying to change. And finally, hopefully you're able to find evidence about why focusing on one specific community challenge has broader implications for boosting mobility from poverty, and what longer-term outcomes focusing on this issue could ideally lead to in terms of making change. So hopefully, taking all that data, along with engagement from community members, this will lead you to target the right solutions in your community and address the following. One, identifying which target populations would be best served by added support for the intervention. And just note, when doing so, you will not be able to serve your whole community with any policy effort you choose, as of course you know. So it's important to identify where you can have that appropriate impact based on all the data and information that I just discussed. Next, determining the levers for change, excuse me, that you'd like to make. What steps can you take that directly impact the goals that you have in place and the outcomes that you'd like to achieve? And then finally, understanding who can help your efforts and the dynamics in your community around making change, which I'll cover in a second in the next slide, or the forthcoming slide. Next slide, please. Okay, considering that you yourselves as community foundations are not policymakers who cannot necessarily pass new policies, although you could potentially influence them, you'll need to make the case for why change is needed and why the status quo is insufficient for addressing the challenge you see in your community. So a couple cases that can be made in mapping ways to influence change is identifying who the primary and secondary actors and organizations are that control influence. Then identifying on the flip side what forces within your foundation or community in particular have the ability to push policies and options forward. Flip side of that, what are the forces that oppose or hold back the ability to make change? Thinking about equity implications in your community. And then how does the public impact and influence your policy ecosystem? What are opinions? What is the policies nationally that are impacting you at the state level, et cetera? Next slide. Okay, so just 2 more slides here. So we encourage you to identify critical partners, as we've been discussing, without whom you will not be successful in making change in your community. To identify critical partners, you may want to ask those questions about the potential organizations that you'd like to engage. And we have a couple of these questions here and a couple of the partners that you might want to engage. But specifically, you might want to ask, what activities or initiatives does the organization undertake that might align with your efforts to boost mobility from poverty? Are they focused on systems change, or are they more focused at the individual service level? What assets might the stakeholder bring to the partnership? Assets might include things like research and analytic capability, staff, financial resources, political clout, key relationships, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Something to consider. Thinking about motivations, what motivates the organization? Why are they in this? Does it align with your goals? Does it align with the goals of upward mobility? And also thinking about their roles, not just your role. Are the individuals working in an organization that have frontline ability? Can they influence technical knowledge? Can they make changes by transforming system? Can they make policy changes, et cetera? Next slide. And then finally, gotten through all of this, you're now at the point where you can start planning out the actual approach to systems change. And this calls back to that first slide, thinking about your role. And what is the role that you want to be in or that you can be in? Can it be multiple of these? Is it convener? Is it educator? Capacity builder? Funder? Champion? Defender? Partner? Building out a coalition? Partnering in a coalition, et cetera. So a lot to consider. A lot of that draws on the guide that we referenced, but a lot of it isn't necessarily available online. So happy to talk further. But right now I'm going to kick it back over to Tina, and Tina's going to take us on a bit of a shift here to diving deeper on the mobility metrics and the data tables that are available and how folks can actually go about in your community looking at some of this data that's available online. So Tina.
Thanks so much, Will. Yeah, a big part of every component Will described is information gathering. And so that is where we see these metrics plugging in and being a useful leverage point for your community foundation. So let's start with understanding the data tables in general and what they provide. So our suite of mobility metrics has 26 metrics overall that represents the 24 predictors of the upward mobility framework. So you may realize that 2 of the predictors, that means, have 2 metrics representing them. The metrics are organized into what we refer to as the data tables, and those can be accessed at the county and at the city level. And we have these data tables available for all 3,143 counties across the US and for over 480 cities as well. When we use the term city, we are actually explicitly referring to large census places. And we specify a population cutoff of 75,000 or more within any given census place jurisdiction. For places that have smaller populations, a lot of the data sources that comprise the mobility metrics just do not have large enough sample sizes for the level of accuracy that we like to provide. So for anyone in a city with a smaller population, we suggest looking at the county that your city happens to fall within. These data tables, they can be viewed online, they can be shared with other people via link. They can also be downloaded and printed and saved as a PDF as needed for your purposes. And with that, I think we're going to take down the slides, and I'm going to start sharing my screen with you all to show you how you can go into the data tables yourselves through our Upward Mobility website. This should load in a moment. Let me know if you cannot see it. All good? Okay, great. So when you visit the Upward Mobility website, you see this graphic at the beginning, then you can get into the framework here below. But if you're looking specifically for the mobility metrics, you're actually going to go to this top header navigation menu and click the data tab that's right in the middle there. That will take you to our data landing page, which should look just like this, with this header that says measuring upward mobility in counties and cities across the US. Now, on this page, if you scroll a little bit, at the bottom of this introductory background, you'll see this big blue button that says watch video. This is a video tutorial for anyone who either doesn't remember or doesn't want to rewatch this presentation in the future. This tutorial will walk you through a lot of the same components that we're about to walk through together. Now, if you actually want to access the data itself, it's right underneath this where it says mobility metrics data. Here it is, 1 second. Okay, so your first step before you'd start entering in anything is to decide which type of geography makes the most sense for your needs when it comes to accessing the data. So you might ask yourself, what jurisdiction is the one where I have the most influence? Which policies at what level of geography most impact me and my work in my community or for my community foundation? And with that answer in mind, first you will decide if you're looking at a county or if you're looking at a city, and then you will put in a specific state. And you can either scroll here or you can look it up manually by typing in. So here I'll click Rhode Island because that's the state that I grew up in. And then I will select a county. And as soon as you make these 2 selections, both this button pops up and becomes available to you. When you click View Data Tables, it will open up a new HTML within the same browser that you have open. Okay, and so this is a custom data table that has been populated for you. If you ever need to go back and make other comparison, tables that you want to look at, you can click right over back to that tab and select a different one. You can always say reset data table selection if you want to start from scratch again. So now let's go into our data table itself. Okay, this is what it looks like when you open one up for a county. I just want to note the general organizational structure of these tables. So you can navigate to different mobility metrics by clicking through these color-coded pillars on the left side. You can also, of course, scroll your whole way through this table, but it's quite long. So clicking just makes it a little bit quicker. It hyperlinks you straight to each of the pillar sections. To show you what the numbers look like in these pillars, let's actually go ahead and select one together. So I'm going to click the high quality education pillar. So this brings us to the page with all of the education predictors right underneath it. So this is the pillar organization. And as you scroll, you'll see each of the predictors followed by the metric right underneath. So right under, for example, let's go to digital access, which is the last one here. So right here, it says predictors digital access, right? But then right underneath it, it actually tells you what the data point is. Here's the metric. And for digital access, the metric is the share of people in households with broadband access in their home. You also see that there's actually three tabs at the top of each of these data tables. So the first one is called the summary tab, and that is the main default view that you're going to see in all of the tables. It's meant to give you quick access to your metric values for the most recent year of data that is available for that metric and for that predictor. Each metric also has what's called a data quality index right underneath the metric value within each of these tables, and this will either read as strong, marginal, or weak, and is just designed to offer a given user the sense of reliability that they can have in the values that are presented. And then in smaller print at the bottom of each of these tables is, of course, the data source that's offered here. Now, when you go into the next tab, which is the detail tab, the only thing that changes is that on top of having the source here in small print, you also have some table notes. Now, what these notes serve to do is essentially give you a little more information about how terms are being defined in the metric, and sometimes a little more information about interpretability. How is it that you should interpret a specific ratio or index number? When you click the More Data tab, which is the third tab that's available to you, this is where we offer any and all subgroup information, any disaggregations that are possible for each of these metrics. In most cases, this is going to be a disaggregation by race or ethnicity. And we worked to maximize subgroup level data across all of the metrics in order to encourage an interrogation of, the structures and specific communities that are being affected by each component in this framework. And in order to allow for more equitable targeting of supports and interventions that are decided on derivative of these data insights. So in our digital access example here on the screen, we can see that in addition to the overall value up top, right here it says for all races and ethnicities, this is the value. This is the same value that you saw in the summary tab, right? So it's the one that was initially showed to you. That's the average for everyone. But then underneath it, you start to see these disaggregations. So you can look specifically for Black households and families. You can look specifically at Hispanic families and specifically at white families, and you'll see that these numbers begin to differ. And therefore, just looking at the average may be insufficient. And in fact, some families of specific subgroups may be experiencing quite different outcomes for different systemic reasons that need to be further interrogated. So this sort of discrepancy, when you notice it, can be the starting point for examining all sorts of possible systemic variables, and they definitely need to be taken into account when deciding on targeting any programmatic intervention that's designed, for example, to raise access to high-speed broadband, which would be the implication of this metric specifically. It would make sure that it would raise it equitably for all the subgroups in the community. One last thing that I will mention about this third tab here, the More Data tab, this isn't true for necessarily all of the metrics, and it's not equally true for all of them, but beyond just showing you all of the subgroup disaggregations that are available for each of the metrics, it will also provide you more years of data when we have it. Right here for digital access, we do not have more than the 2021 year, but you'll notice for some of the other metrics up above that you'll have 2021 going back to 2018 and sometimes going all the way back to 2014 as well. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing screen, and I believe we'll briefly go back to slides here. I do want to mention again, we just talked about the other years of data. So yeah, I want to mention these other data resources that are available to you. So we just walked through the data tables. Will briefly touched on the planning guide for local action. Both of these are very rich resources. But for example, when it comes to the more years of data retroactively, our data tables are limited aesthetically in being able to show only so many years of data. Usually we only show 2. That does not mean that more years of data don't exist going back further than beyond 2020. And if you are ever interested in seeing that information, you can download the raw data from our online urban data catalog. We also have a data dictionary that helps any user walk through the different components that we offer, all of the racial subgroup disaggregations, etc. We also have what's called an evidence resource library. And the evidence resource library is actually hyperlinked for each of the predictors within the data table as well. And what that serves as is essentially a small grouping of literature reviews. So for each of the predictors that we have in the framework, we have a short summary of all of the research and evidence that was consulted to determine that this predictor deserved to be included in the upward mobility framework. So you can always go back and look at all of the source information. We also have our GitHub repository made public for anyone who wants to see how these metrics data were compiled using public resources and different data sources, and then analyzed and then put out into these data tables. And therefore, also, if you have data literate or savvy people on your teams at your community foundations, you can leverage that code for your own purposes and see different cuts of data as necessary. We also have a blog on our Upward Mobility website that has several entries that may be of, useful leverage to you. And lastly, on our website, we also have a subpage of all of the mobility action plans that came out of our work with the beta cohort that originally tested our upward mobility framework. If you are interested in seeing how local government leaders and municipalities approached the planning process using both community engagement and interaction with the mobility metrics and other local data sources to determine a plan of action for improving upward mobility on the ground. And then this last section, forthcoming editions, we do have a data dashboard in the works planned for publication in summer of next year. So the data tables may look a little different in the future. However, we hope they will look even better and even more accessible in the dashboard format. And there will be a bunch of support tool features around that as well. And of course, future workshops held by Urban, including presentations like this one. I think with that, we can hand over to Leonard.
Awesome. Wonderful resources for the field, for sure. My colleague, Anita Jederick, and I had the chance to conduct outreach to community foundations over the summer, and many community foundations may reference the need for having metrics to develop their North Star, or what we're calling discipline of development around what gets measured gets done, obviously. So I do want to field a few questions from the audience, but I have a few questions myself that I would like to pose, if it's okay with you all. I understand that the planning guide is developed for a different audience. And when I had a chance to look through it, I found it to be extremely rich, comprehensive. And I wish that was a tool that existed for a few years ago when I was leading this public-private partnership that was very complicated, needless to say. And it's a great tool for communities across the US. So I want to know how community foundations specifically could use the planning guide. And if you also have some findings or some highlights from the 8 counties that were able to develop a planning guide as a result of going through the process with Urban over the summer or previously.
Yeah, I can just jump in on that first piece. Thanks, Leonard. And I mentioned some of this. So like the planning guide wasn't actually developed for community foundations. It was developed coming out of working with those 8 counties. But all the lessons learned, we really do think, or almost all of them, could be quite applicable to really anyone trying to move forward with making upward mobility systemic change locally. So if you look at the planning guide, and it's quite long, but each of the steps are pretty spelled out. A lot of them just presumably would be very relevant to community foundations. There's goals on developing an initial understanding of local mobility conditions in your community. And then there's like a stepwise process for how you can go about doing that. And then there are literal resources and materials and handouts and such that can be used in your community for gathering that information and building the case using data and feedback from others on why there is needed systematic change. And that came from the work directly from working in those counties and could be used by a community foundation, could be used by an advocate, could be used by others. Same with the next step, which is building a fuller picture of mobility conditions in your community. And then the next step is prioritizing strategic action. So a lot of what I was talking about before was adapted from this, just a little bit towards community foundations, but most of it's like right there in this planning guide. And it's built in this way that you could take certain resources out of it and use it in your community directly. You could use it with a group setting. You could use it for a planning meeting, et cetera. The one section that's maybe least relevant to community foundations is just on building your coalition for systems change. And that's what we were talking about a little bit, because that's coming from a perspective of a government entity working with folks in the community to build out this coalition that would include a community foundation, for example. And so just some of those would need to be adapted from the community foundation perspective. But otherwise, really appreciate the kind words, Leonard, on the usefulness. And we just heard very positive feedback on folks identifying what it is in terms of the plan that they would like to take, the challenges that they're facing in their community, and then using that information to implement changes moving forward.
Awesome, thank you. And this is a more of a rudimentary question. I had a question about the metrics in general. Systems change takes time, and community foundations are intermediaries. So are all the metrics system level indicators, or are there process measures, or can you say a bit more about how community foundations could use the measures or the metrics to determine progress that may be at a proximate level that may not be at the systems change level? If that makes any sense.
Yes, that absolutely makes sense. And it's a very fair and common conundrum that we face. So essentially, this suite of metrics was designed almost explicitly to be all medium-term measures. And to that end, again, in terms of frequency of update, we try to maintain an annual update schedule as the most reasonable expectation for these metrics. So to that end, when you are working at a programmatic level or lobbying very specific and like time-sensitive changes, you need much shorter term measures to be aligned with these as well, right? And so we suggest not only adding shorter term measures, but much larger term measures as well, which are either at a larger community level or are capturing, you know, specific data points that maybe the metrics, because they have to be generalized for the entirety of the country, are not capturing specifically for your community. So a big component of engaging with these metrics is engaging with them almost as a starting point. So they should be a lighthouse that then allows you an access point for asking the right follow-up questions and determining the right gaps in information, both like timeline wise as well as further elucidation, to determine what data you need to collect to get a fuller picture and make sure that you're not only diagnosing your problems accurately, but finding an effective way to track them down the line as well.
Awesome. And I'm waiting to see if we have any questions from the audience. And if there are any questions, please add those to the Q&A section. And I do have a few more questions here. Were there any community foundations that engaged in the work prior? So with the counties that were able to develop a planning guide, or just with the work from the metrics, are you familiar with any community foundations that have engaged in this work? And we can engage, and if there's a way that we can engage directly with those community foundations to learn from them.
Yes, so sorry, go ahead, Will. So
No, go for it, Gina.
There's certainly several. I cannot speak to specific names off the top of my head. However, we mentioned these mobility action plans that are published online on the framework website. A lot of those local municipal leaders did engage with community foundations on various different levels, right? So either to facilitate help for getting community validation for a lot of their data insights. So frequently they were pursuing things like data walks and trying to find ways to disseminate the information and engage their community on the ground level in order to make sure not only people were invested in the process and interested in the idea and like gave it momentum moving forward, but also to like better inform their insights and make sure they were investing across the right policies and areas of interest. So community foundations were vital in that respect, and also from the funding perspective, of course, right? Because at the end of the day, resources are key to getting anything across the finish line. So those are definitely worth checking out to that extent. I do know also that we have ad hoc been engaging some community foundations who have been independently interested in using the mobility metrics framework to, you know, better inform their processes and or provide some structure to processes that they have already been pursuing in the policy space. So happy to follow up accordingly as helpful.
Thank you.
And sorry, I was just gonna do the promotional aspect, which is just chiming in also that we're hopeful that through coordination with CF Leads and being on webinars like this, that we can help make sure that these tools are getting in the hands of community foundations that are interested in this, and hopefully working directly with CF Leads to answer questions, you know, outside of webinars like this, and help develop some models specific to community foundations that might be asking questions. So just assuming that question was maybe a little forward looking, and that's very much how we're hoping to help just get these tools in your hands.
Absolutely. We're looking forward to working hand in glove with you as we're looking to strengthen or extend our work to other community foundations that are looking to get on the ladder. So we just recently received $4.8 million from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to continue our work in the economic mobility space. And that's going to consist of the launch of 2 action networks next year, a host of regional convenings, and more blogs and webinars. So we're very much looking forward to working with you so we can get this information in the hands of community foundations. And I do have a question from someone in the audience, one of the participants. It says, this looks spot on for us, community foundations. In the first cohort, the county cities tend to use consultants or specifically hire coordinators to develop their plans. What models did you observe on this person? They had to step away for a moment, so apologize if this was already mentioned.
Yeah, I can jump in and then others feel free to chime in, but it varied, of course. So some of the jurisdictions did hire consultants and did work with consultants and built it into their funding model to work with external partners. Others developed it just locally and had a local county staff person tasked with the role and then coordinated across agencies. So there's variation, of course. That one was a little different in terms of we were providing technical assistance and there was some funding support in working with those counties. So there was like this baked in model of working with Urban to move that forward, but there was variation in terms of how that was implemented. In terms of the models, and you may have missed this, the planning guide comes very directly from that learning experience. So a lot of the models are really defined throughout this quite lengthy, quite useful resource. But I'll potentially point you towards a specific step of step 4, which I referenced, which is building your coalition for systems change. And within that one, there are some specific models around identifying champions, a management team, and then key stakeholder partners. And there's like these concentric circles that are shown in a visual of how to develop that out locally. But of course, there's variation within local communities of how to move that forward, and several other steps as well. Walk through some potential processes of use. The third step is more specific to local government, but it's ensuring your local government is ready to undertake this work, and it's preparing some of the buy-in and foundational change that's needed to try to put forth these efforts. So hopefully that answers your question, but variation, of course, across communities.
As it relates to readiness of local government, I'm curious of what would be some of those preconditions that a community foundation should take into consideration if they're going to engage as a convener or anchor institution to drive this work forward. If you know offhand just some of those preconditions or how ready those readiness assessment indicators that the government should take into consideration to be ready to move this work forward. Do you have some of that information offhand by any chance?
I can read from our planning guide, which is one, a clear commitment for local government leadership, but local leadership, community foundation leadership. 2, preparedness for cross-sector partnerships across policy domains. Next is sufficient organizational capacity to undertake this work. An organizational culture that can support large-scale change, certainly challenging for a lot of local organizations. Capacity, as I mentioned before, can be a challenge. Buy-in from staff across departments. You know, we've all seen where a leader might want to move something forward, but if folks at the more line level or across departments and agencies don't buy in, you can have a lot of challenges in terms of implementation, of course. And then a desire to build a shared understanding of structural racism and racial equity. This frankly was a challenge in some communities that work in states or political realms where there isn't support for this in this day and age, and that can very much be challenging and just an absolute hindrance to this type of work, as folks might be familiar, unfortunately. Then knowledge of the skills and capacity for data gathering and analysis. Data staff is a challenge for a lot of community foundations. A lot of local government as well have limited data capabilities, so that's certainly a challenge. And then dedicated resources for meaningful community engagement, bringing folks together, being that convener that we talked about. And finally, a commitment to ongoing learning and improvement. So you knock all of those out, you'll be in great shape, but I imagine there will be opportunities for improvement across a lot of communities trying to take on this work.
That's awesome. So we have the definition for poverty, economic success, power and autonomy, being valued in community. There's the framework, we have the metrics, and we also have the planning guide. These are wonderful tools, wonderful resources that we have for the Community Foundation field. And I don't have any more questions from the audience, but I do have just 2 more quick questions I wanted to ask before we jump off the call. If there's a person who may still have a question about interpreting the metrics after reading the description and the additional details that were provided, what could they do? Where could they go to get more information so they can actually be able to use the metrics and the indicators to drive progress in their local community?
Yeah, this is a great question. Very understandable. So there's a couple of different resources available to you, depending on how much of the nitty-gritty you want to get into. One thing I didn't get into when doing the data tables demonstration is that when you produce this data table, right, this interactive online HTML for your jurisdiction, on the top left, you'll notice there's a home button, but also a description button. And I didn't open up that description button because there was already a lot of information to see on the page there. But if you are interested, when you click description, it actually takes you to a more exhaustive page that goes through metric by metric and expounds both on the definition of the metric and why that data point was chosen, but also walks through each and every one of the criteria that we used and explains both the data source, the frequency of the data that is coming through, and also limitations of the metric that help with the interpretation value. Beyond that, if you wanted to see what other metrics were considered and why this metric was, determined to be comparatively more advantageous, as a representation of the predictor, you can always go to the multiple publications that we have based around this framework, which can all be found on the Upward Mobility website as well. Instead of going to that tab at the top that says data, you just go to the one that says reports. And we have a summary report there as well as a technical report. And depending on how much information you want to glean, it truly is all there for you to scroll through. And even beyond that, you can always reach out to our team through our project email and ask any questions if you truly hit a wall.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tina. And just for clarity, the metrics or the data tables are updated on an annual basis. Okay, making sure. All right, sounds great. I don't see another question from the audience, and those are all the questions that I had. I really sincerely appreciate you taking the time to engage in this webinar and inform the field. I look forward to working hand in glove with you as it relates to engaging more community foundations and taking the show on a roll. Perhaps we can have a regional convening or regional meeting where we actually can meet in person with community foundations. And I'm looking forward to engage community foundations and action networks in the new year. So there's more information to come soon. I know my colleagues placed a press release in the chat. So for those who want more information about the Economic Mobility Action Network or more information coming from CF Leads, please feel free to follow up accordingly. Arzo, Will, and Tina, I can't thank you enough. This was very valuable to the field, and I look forward to working hand in glove with you in the near future. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Appreciate you all so much. Thank you.